Over the past few years in Boston, there's been a surge of new housing production, but also more concern about housing costs. By the city's definition, 40% of the new supply is affordable, and officials say rents are starting to come down. But our guest argues the numbers fail to reflect the whole story. She's an independent planner who recently posted her own look at the Boston housing picture on Medium. We'd like to welcome Grace Holley. Thank you very much for being with us, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, when you hear about all this production and 40% affordable, it sounds really impressive, but tell me, why do you have some doubts about that?
Well, I have doubts. So I work in the affordable housing kind of arena in Boston, and so I've been digging into the city's reports, like their Housing 2030 report and all of their big housing reports over the past couple of years, and I've seen I've taken a look at numbers in all of these reports and noticed a lot of inconsistencies in the numbers. And basically, looking at the chart that I included in my post, which isn't something that's posted anywhere like on the city website. It's kind of broken down in different parts of different reports, but there's nowhere where it's just published like as a whole. It shows that 40% that's considered affordable housing, more than half of that is actually market rate housing. So that's like really interesting and concerning to a lot of people, especially who work in housing, because people generally think of affordable housing as being deed restricted or specifically set aside for people of certain incomes. But here we're seeing, the claims by the city, 40% is affordable, but more than half of those units, it's like 5,000 something out of the 9,000 are actually market rate and geared towards people making like $90,000 a year.
Even six-figure salaries at the highest
exactly.
end. Mm-hmm. And do we have any breakdown? I mean, between that high end and middle end and maybe the lower end?
Yeah. So there is that whole chart. So it's kind of hard to go over all of the numbers, but basically we're seeing we're seeing more being built for what's like the considered upper middle income. So like the city defines low income as people making up to $50,000 a year, and middle income is people making $50,000 to $125,000 a year, or households making that much. But the median the median income in Boston is $55,000, and actually most people make around $35,000 or less. Most people working, obviously, if you're working full time, minimum wage, you're making like $30,000 a year. So, so what we're seeing is kind of the definition of middle income is $50,000 a year to $125,000 a year, and we're seeing a lot being built for just kind of the upper middle portion of that. And obviously, like this is included in what's considered affordable. Beyond that, we're seeing obviously things being built for, people making even more than that, $200,000 a year incomes, $3,000+ studio rents, things like that. So it's very kind of misleading, I think, to put it out there that 40% is affordable.
Well, to make it even more confusing, there are these different standards for what's affordable. By one standard, it could be 50% of the household income. By another, it could be 35 or 30, that is the amount of money spent on housing. That sounds strange, doesn't it?
It is really strange, and that's another big issue that I have with these numbers and that a lot of people have. So this is kind of like one of the main things is I was trying to look at how the city actually defines affordable. And so like HUD, nationally defines affordable as households in which, the occupants are spending up to 30% of their income on total housing costs, including utilities. And so that's kind of a very standard definition. Like a lot of planners, a lot of people who work in housing, and a lot of cities use that definition. And, looking through Boston's reports, I was seeing a lot of 35%, which, may not seem like a big difference, but 35% on rent alone too, and not including utilities, adds up to thousands of dollars more per year as being considered affordable. And then in the main housing report, sorry, there's like a lot of numbers, but in the main housing report, they define affordable as households with children, the household is affordable if the occupants are paying up to 35% of income on rent. And then, which crazy is people without children, households considered affordable spending up to 50% on rent. And that's just like very bizarre because, by head and by pretty much any definition of affordability, if you're spending 50% of your income on rent, that's considered like you're severely cost burdened, like you can't afford other things that you need in life. So it's really odd that they would include that as affordable housing.
This has been news. We're talking about housing affordability with community planner Grace Holley. Grace, another thing that's hard to dispute in a way is the notion that if you add enough supply, there's going to be some trickle-down relief in the rest of the market. And when you look at the city's reports about rents starting to come down in different parts of the city, even whether it's downtown or in more outlying neighborhoods, that looks like it's a step in the right direction. But even again, you're saying maybe it's not as big as you think it is.
Right. So kind of the whole issue of supply and what's being added is kind of like a whole other issue here. But as far as the rents going down and that sort of claim, this was something that was really surprising to me to hear that, because I get hundreds of emails from tenants around the city who tell me like my rent went up 200%, 250%. What do I do? Like, what are my rights here? And so I actually met with the city along with some of my colleagues in August to talk about this and like what methodology they used and how they came up with the number. They were saying the rents, overall rents in Boston are down like 4%. From 2015 to 2016, like down 9% in Roxbury. And so kind of a lot of us working in housing were, how? And so we met with the city, and our suspicions were kind of confirmed, like basically how the city measures rents going up and down, which is how a lot of cities measure rents, is basically just using a very tiny slice of the housing stock. So they take data from MLS listings and from Rental Beast, which are two websites where like landlords and building owners can post their their units for rent, basically. So they track from one year to the next, increases there, decreases there, and what's left out of that is actually most of Boston's housing stock. So it includes like things that aren't reflected in that are, say you've lived in a unit for 10 years and suddenly your rent goes up $200 a month, but because your unit wasn't listed from year to year online because your landlord didn't have to advertise, that's not reflected. Only the new rent is listed. And then in addition to that, if you're evicted or if the whole building's flipped,
or priced out simply.
or priced out, yeah, exactly. If like priced out, or if your landlord raises the rent and you stay there paying more, it's not going to be included in that picture. So I think what the decrease of 4% represents is, if you build a lot of market housing, obviously the market's going to fix itself a little bit, correct itself, and rents are going to decrease at that level a little bit, but it's not necessarily reflective of what's going on kind of with most lower income and moderate income renters. It's only at the high end.
I do know of one unit in a pricier part of town where the rent has come down, and in that same area there's a whole lot of new upscale supply, so that makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. But what about the bottom of the market? Is there a softening in the bottom as much as at the top, maybe?
No, I haven't seen any sort of softening whatsoever. In fact, I've seen hardening. I've seen rents going up at the very bottom. And again, this is something that these units tend to not be listed on these websites. These are, a lot of landlords, with higher end kind of units are posting on these websites, whereas if you're like a month-to-month tenant, or if you're in like a much kind of older building, or like even like a lot of these units are posted on Craigslist, like landlords who don't use MLS or Rental Beast tend to be kind of ones renting these lower income units. And, unfortunately, there's not good data showing what's happening at the bottom, but I mean, you read it all the time. Evictions are, mass evictions are increasing. You look at East Boston, Chinatown. You're seeing land and buildings being bought up, with speculation turned into Airbnbs. All of that on top of just, renovated and kind of turned into luxury housing. So I think we're kind of seeing this narrative that like the city and a lot of people and a lot of cities are putting out that, building all of this luxury market rate housing will help everybody, but I think it's taking way too long for it to trickle down and help those who need it the most. Instead, I think we're seeing a lot of our diversity kind of leave the city, and a lot of, people who've lived in these neighborhoods for decades and years getting priced out.
Of course, one of the things that people are very focused on is the dilemma, let's say around Eggleston Square, because on one hand you have people paying $1,000 a month where they've been tenants for several years. They're getting priced out. People want to build up something new where the rents might be closer to $3,000 a month. Do you shut off new supply, or do you let them build because there's just no other way to get around it?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not opposed to new building. In my opinion, I think it's kind of crazy to build all of this new, very high-end housing around neighborhoods that have housed lower to moderate income people without any sort of regulation. Like, obviously, we don't have any rent regulation in Boston. We don't have much protection for renters. I know some landlords might argue with that, but compared to most other cities like New York, San Francisco, most big cities do have some sort of rent regulation. It's kind of crazy to think, to argue that you can build all of this luxury housing and people of lower incomes aren't going to see any effect. Obviously, like these higher price units tend to act as price leaders in an area, so kind of what's around them kind of increase to meet them. So yeah, I think we really need to increase our supply of affordable, truly affordable, lower to moderate, truly moderate income housing. I think we need changes in our policies. We need to increase requirements for on-site affordable units, and I think we seriously, there's such a stigma around it in Boston, but we seriously need to look at regulation and things like rent control.
Well, 20 or 30 years ago, people would have been talking about getting more money from the state or the federal government. That's almost a non-starter these days. But what about getting more money from developers? The mayor has actually raised the bar on what they have to contribute for affordable housing, but compared with other cities, could that bar go even higher maybe?
I think so, and I do think, the mayor did do a great thing by changing the inclusionary development policy and asking more from developers. At the same time, the requirement for affordable units on site stayed the same with the policy. So it was 13%, which it has been for many years, and it's still 13%. Whereas you're seeing Cambridge and other kind of more progressive cities increase that to 20%. A lot of tenant organizations around the city want to see it increase to at least 25%. Again, we're talking affordable, not super low income. Affordable now means, people, as the city defines it, making up to $125,000. So, it's just, we need to see, I think, more drastic measures, if you will. And I think that's one way to do it, is kind of increasing the percentage on site. And also, I think we can still ask more of developers. I know it's a fear that, if we ask too much, they're not going to develop here. We're going to become a ghost town, and no one's going to want to build here. But I definitely think that, that's only true to a very certain extent. I think that Boston will still thrive business-wise and will be okay if we have more regulation and increases in subsidies. otherwise I think we're going to totally lose, the Boston that we've known for many years. And
Well, we should finally say that if people want to see your post in all its detail, you're on Medium, so how should they find that?
so yeah, this was actually my first post on Medium. Not a writer, just wanted to kind of get this information out there. But basically, if you just Google Medium Grace Holley, and I'm guessing my name's like showing up on the screen.
Holley, that is, okay?
Yeah, yep, Holley. You can just search that, and it's called What Does Affordable Mean in Boston? And you can read all about it there.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Grace Holley. We'll have more news in a moment.